Welcome to Wavelengths, a podcast with Amphenol Broadband Solutions.
What's going on, everyone? It's Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and welcome to another episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. It's a pleasure to be back in the hot seat in 2025 for some more dialogue, discourse, debates, and overall thought leadership on the larger broadband and telecom industries. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome to Wavelengths. If you're returning, it's good to have you back. But regardless, make sure you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, that's amphenolbroadband.com for not only a full look at all of our previous episodes of the show, but of course, for more information on our solutions and services and other thought-leading and research-focused resources on the state of the industry. So, folks, we've got a pretty wide topic here for today's discussion. So we're going to be hitting on quite a lot, but there is a thematic overview here. We're going to be doing a bit of a state of the union on broadband access, broadband deployment, and development. And we're going to be looking through two main lenses, right? The city and the countryside. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at how trends like smart city development are animating the further development of broadband access in urban areas. And we're also going to be looking at how rural areas are faring with this larger mission that we've been talking about for years now of improved broadband access across the entire United States, especially in rural areas. Right? So we're going to be looking at some recent trends and news to give a timely touch point on this conversation. We're going to be looking at broadband technology development, general broadband access, broadband deployment, and some of the larger trends that are shaping connectivity needs in both rural and urban areas. You might be thinking, wow, that's quite a lot for one podcast episode, but we have no one better to break this down than a returning guest who can paint that wide picture of this broadband state of the union here to kick off 2025. So I'm pleased to welcome back to the show. It's been a hot minute, Mr. Tyler Cooper. He's editor-in-chief at BroadbandNow. Tyler, it's good to sit down with you again. How you doing today?
Daniel, great to be here. No, thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Absolutely. Should be a productive one. Again, there's a lot to break down, so don't feel like you got to get too in the weeds on any one of these. But, I'm excited to get this overview again on general broadband developments over the last year, and more specifically, how they differ, and also where we maybe see some similarities in terms of animating forces in rural and urban settings. So over the last year, we've seen further deployments of BEAD funding, right? Texas had, for example, $3.3 billion in allocation for rural fiber. Pretty nice. We've seen the growth of fixed wireless access, right, which has added a lot of subscribers over the last year. And we're also seeing huge trends impacting the development of, smart city networks, which of course put fresh demand on fiber connectivity, right? Cities are embedding AI into their traffic systems, into their energy grids. We're starting to see this idea of the 15-minute city actually become more of a reality and less of a theoretical talking point or goal. So that's just to paint, the initial picture here. But to get that initial high-level overview of broadband deployment over the last year, what would you say have been some of the most consequential developments here, right? We could talk policy, we could talk technology, we could talk adoption trends. What is really playing a consequential role in broadband development here in the U.S. right now?
I think we're at a very critical moment for especially rural connectivity, but definitely just American connectivity as a whole. Our latest research on the numbers shows that about 22 million Americans still lack basic broadband access. And this comes at a time when the FCC has just recently upgraded their standard for what is considered broadband. So that number might even be higher by the new standard. So it was 25 megabits per second download, 3 up. It's now 100 over 20, which is a welcome change. And we can talk about that as well. But really what we have, in my opinion, are 3 waves that are kind of crashing simultaneously right now. And the first one is what you mentioned. So we have the BEAD program finally rolling out. So this is the largest investment in broadband infrastructure in U.S. history. There's what makes this program different, aside from the scale of it too, is obviously, unlike previous programs, states are in the driver's seat this time. And what we've done a lot of research looking specifically at state level broadband discrepancies. And we found that this could be a game changer, because not only are there states that definitely lag behind others, especially ones that have a lot of rural area, like my home state of Texas, but also we found that these state broadband offices, even the ones that are sort of newly established and just getting going, they tend to understand local challenges better than federal administrators, right? They understand the topography, they understand any other difficulties when it comes to deploying broadband and sort of closing this divide. So we have that, and that's money is changing hands this year. This is something where the program is finally getting underway, right after years of planning and preparation. The second wave, in my opinion, of the three waves that are crashing is the sort of changing technology mix that we're seeing happen, right? Obviously, fiber is the gold standard for broadband. It's the only technology we know of that's future proofed and that is sort of able to provide for not only some of the use cases we have today, but also some of the ones we might not even be able to conceive of in the future. But ultimately, it's probably going to be in the immediate term a combination of technologies we're seeing emerge that are going to crack this problem, right? You mentioned fixed wireless. Fixed wireless, it has massive potential. There's been a massive effort to build out fixed wireless networks in rural communities, which is great, and it's going to be a big part of this puzzle. I think it is important to note that again, and we could talk about the issue of actual reporting of broadband data. And in fact, that's sort of the third wave I was going to mention. But we found that fixed wireless is one of the most overstated technologies available currently. So there's both promise and peril there as more money is changing hands. And to drill down into that a little bit, so this is something we don't talk about enough, even though it's kind of all I talk about. But we sort of have this change happening finally in how we measure the problem, right? How we measure broadband. The last time we spoke was just a few years ago, and even then we were still dealing with a fundamentally flawed methodology for measuring where broadband is and isn't, right? We were using the census block as a level of granularity, and it just wasn't cutting it. So we're finally now getting into this phase where we're measuring things really down to the address level. We're getting granular house by house data about who really has service and who doesn't. And that means we can actually target solutions now with surgical precision rather than just throwing money at the problem, which we kind of always have done.
Yeah, and I mean, those are some big waves, right? I can see why those are the most critical, shaping the whole industry. I want to hone in on the last point you had, which was even just a few years ago, we were still kind of debating the efficacy of the tried and true methods for gauging whether or not a municipality or a region has sufficient broadband deployment and access, right? I want to reference some recent reporting from y'all. This is from last year, so things may have changed. But as of 2024, y'all had some reporting that showed that broadband is still overstated in basically every state. 43% of urban zips lack universal access despite ISP claims. I'm curious how this incomplete picture is still kind of shaping the development of broadband today. I mean, you've said things are getting a little better, right? And I know some other reporting shows that we're starting to get a better picture of the broadband map, right? But would you say that there are still major gaps in data that are preventing the proper rollout of, for example, BEAD funds or the responsiveness between local needs and regional, state, or even federal action?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, first of all, that responsiveness element, that's a big part of this, right? A lot of times we're sort of operating on a lag when it comes to federal initiatives, right? Where we're trying to solve problems and they take a lot of time to solve. But by the time we get around to the solution, the problem might have changed. And so that's an issue, certainly, for some of these areas that have long been broadband deserts. You mentioned over the past few years, we've been debating the standard for broadband and sort of what it means to be serviced, right? And what it means to have a connection that's usable. That conversation has shifted in the past few years, and certainly, post pandemic, right? The conversation has shifted dramatically. A good example of that I think is interesting, and we can kind of talk about this more when we start talking about the concept of a smart city and urban planning a bit. But something that I find fascinating is, we spent decades building out network infrastructure with the basic assumption that people would commute to bandwidth, right? That we would have this idea of, we built out these next generation data centers and these giant pipes going into downtown areas. This was great, obviously. It was like, building a water system where all the major reservoirs were in the business district. But then 2020 hit, and we realized in many cases that we built it all backwards, right? We sort of, instead, we need a system that can distribute capacity, all over the city, being used all day long. For the first time, we're seeing peak usage at 1:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, something that would have been unthinkable 5, definitely 10 years ago, right? So I think that there's definitely a changing, a sort of sliding scale of problems that continuously change as we're trying to deploy these solutions. The level of speed and uptime and latency requirements, even just of the general use cases for the internet have changed dramatically. But as we talk about some of the next generation things that are coming, some of the technologies that we'll hopefully be putting in the hands of everyone over the next several years, the conversation is going to, I think, largely shift from just having broadband and just having the ability to connect to making sure that you have the quality of a connection that will enable you to take advantage of some of these technologies that, by all accounts, are going to be transformative in ways that we've not seen since the very inception of the internet.
I want to highlight some more BroadbandNow reporting and resources. So y'all have your own national broadband map on your website, which I've referenced more than a few times on this podcast. And I was looking at it again in preparation for our interview, and I still see a lot of red and a lot of yellow, right? If for folks that are unfamiliar, you should go check it out. But it maps out basically, down to a really granular region across the entire United States. How many providers are there, right? If it's a red square, there are none, or at least nothing super accessible. Yellow is limited, and then green means that there's multiple options to choose from. So, Tyler, I bring this up because I want to try to get a little more context for our audience here. If we had to rewind even just a year ago, right, to kick off 2024, would you say that there's more yellow and green on that map than there was a year ago? And if so, would you consider it enough to be substantial, or are things kind of static still?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so it's important to reference that the map you're referring to, it is specifically looking at terrestrial broadband. So obviously, some of those areas, you can sign up for, say, a satellite connection virtually anywhere, right? But when we talk about broadband, and again, this conversation is ever shifting, but we're talking about a connection that meets that federal minimum threshold of broadband, and we're talking about terrestrial broadband specifically. So, now we're talking 100/20 as the main metric that we're looking at. To answer your question more directly, I think we have seen progress. I think we're always seeing some level of progress in terms of the infrastructure build out. But I think what we're seeing, what we've really always seen, is this build out that kind of happens in a lopsided way, where we tend to see the private sector focusing on building out edge networks, right? So sort of the very edges of their already established networks, sort of expanding outward, as you naturally would, right? You want to connect to your existing infrastructure, and you also want to target areas that have the greatest potential for a return on your investment, right? And that means after you've covered the cities and you've blanketed it in Wi-Fi and you have a lot of customers there, you want to move slightly out into the suburban areas, right? And perhaps, then finally you move out into some of the rural areas where it doesn't make as much sense. And perhaps then you'll use federal funding. And so for the providers that have done some really great work in that regard, we've seen progress, certainly. But again, we're also we're looking at a puzzle that sort of has, not only different shape pieces, but different sizes, right? And what I mean by that is that in some cases we might be deploying 5G over here, and then another we might be deploying fixed wireless, and another we might be having a fiber builder which is doing really good work in this area. And I think that technology mix, again, is a crucial component of this. There isn't a silver bullet, as much as I wish we could, have a sort of fiber ray gun that would shoot fiber out across everyone's house and lawn and connect everything. That's not really feasible, right? It's certainly a wonderful, long-term aspiration to have universal fiber. But right now we're trying to solve two problems, right? We're trying to solve the problem, the legacy problem we have, which is the access gap, right? The ability to connect to the internet. We should have already solved that, but we need to solve it first, right? We need to make sure that everyone can connect to the internet and do what you and I are doing, Daniel. Right now, there are people who can't do what we're doing, or even listen to this. That's something that is not obvious to people, I think, but it is definitely, if you think about the impact that can have on someone's life, it's profound. And it will become even more profound and more disruptive if we don't solve the second issue, which is the issue, we're having to solve on the fly as well, which is that as we're closing this gap and as we're sort of getting people connected, we need to make sure that we're connecting them with something that will serve them today, but also serve them in 5-10 years, when again, the bandwidth requirements do not resemble what they look like today, right? Whenever the use cases are so different that we might say that some technologies we're deploying are kind of irrelevant in certain cases, right? Like, I think it's fair to say that in 10 years, we might look at a DSL connection based on a 50-year-old copper line and say, that's not internet, right? For all intents and purposes. So I think these are very important conversations that are sort of shifting, right? We've long talked about the access side, and I think it's incredibly important. But we have this other conversation, which is the qualitative element of broadband, right? And also the qualitative element, where we want to make sure that everyone can access these technologies, and we want to make sure that they can do so affordably as well, which is a whole nother conversation.
Right, totally. Speaking of affordability, I'm going to reference some more BroadbandNow research. This is some of the timeliest research y'all have on the site. This was released in late October. But this is basically a pulse check on best and worst states for broadband in 2025. And to back up your comments here with your own findings, it sounds like things are improving in terms of accessibility to affordable broadband, which I think should be encouraging for the larger industry. To put this into context, this is pulling from BroadbandNow research for our audience. In 2024, BroadbandNow found that 48 states have over 50% of their population with access to broadband plans that cost $60 or less per month. So that's the threshold of affordable. If you went back to 2023, only one state had over 50% of their population with access to that kind of affordable broadband plan package, right? So from 1 to 48 is significant. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's more broadband generally. It just at least means that plans are more affordable, and over 50% of the population now has access to more affordable plans. And when we look at the spread of states, we see a lot of coastal states having some of the best internet in terms of coverage, speed, and price. And we see some of the usual suspects of middle America flyover states that have the worst coverage. So a few that stand out for best: New Jersey, Maryland, Connecticut, right? A lot of the Northeast is looking pretty good, but then same with California, Florida, and Virginia. Some of the bottom 10 states include, of course, Alaska, which is going to struggle. But then again, Montana, Iowa, Wyoming, Idaho, even Kansas, Missouri, Wisconsin. Now, it's hard to generalize an entire state as urban versus rural. Obviously, every state has a little of both. But it is interesting to see these trends continue, and kind of in a broad sense, you see your more urban coastal states have better internet, better speed, better prices, and you've got your middle America struggling there a little bit on all fronts as well. Could you peel back some of these generalizations and give us some clarity into the data here? I guess what would be your assessment of this 2024 report? Does it scream things are improving? I mean, because it does sound like affordability is improving at least. Or based on where we're seeing some of this state-by-state action, are there other trends that you think we need to be keeping our eye on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Daniel, I think things are improving, certainly. I think to say things are improving is a fair assessment of the situation. The question is in my mind is not, are things getting better? It's, are they getting better fast enough and in the right ways to be relevant, right? I think um, what we've seen is it's pretty intuitive. What you just laid out makes sense, right? This is the result of the strategy that we've taken at the federal level for the past decade or more, to deploy broadband, right? We're largely leaving these issues to the private sector, and the private sector will build out technologies where it makes sense to build them out. So it's no surprise that where there are millions of paying customers, more networks are being deployed, and the access to affordable networks, especially in those areas, is improving, because more competition means providers are incentivized to undercut each other on price, build out better networks. We see a company like Google Fiber, for instance, come into an existing market. All of a sudden, the other providers, figure out how to do gigabit internet. So certainly, we see that kind of effect happening as new infrastructure is being deployed across the country. In rural areas, especially, most of the time, the way we see that sort of improvement is through federal initiatives, right? When providers are given federal funding to go in and deploy these networks, we do see an increase in affordability, and often it's really not transformative, but it's definitely something, right? Something I like to mention with this report is we kind of have to draw a line in the sand somewhere and define something as affordable, right? And so we sort of use this statistical breakpoint of $60 to kind of draw a line in the sand and say that this is affordable for statistical sake. But obviously it's impossible to define affordability at a scale like sort of the whole nation, right? What's affordable to one person might be different to another based on not only their income but where they live, what their family situation is, how many people they're supporting, there's so many factors that go into defining affordability. It's a fool's errand, which, this tells you a lot about how we're trying to do it, but we are trying to define it, at least to be helpful for the conversation of how we move things forward, right? And I think, again, just zooming out on that note, we are making progress. These initiatives and the money that's going into deploying broadband, the broadband is being deployed. It's just the worrying trend that someone like myself sees as you sort of look at this over the years is that we do have these sort of consistent deserts, these areas that are just so often ignored, that continue to be ignored, and that might be sort of in many cases, I call it sort of the donut hole effect, where we might cover the urban area really well, and then we might cover the extremely rural area really well. But there's this sort of middle section where we're not exactly doing the best job, right? Where it might these we're talking ultimately millions of people, but they might be slipping through the cracks through the current approach. And there's other things that are helping this problem too, right? We certainly have disruptive technologies, again, like some you've mentioned, fixed wireless, 5G, and certainly some of the next generation satellite technologies like the sort of SpaceX Starlink technology. These are very helpful. And they're also kind of shaking up the dynamic in many of these areas where traditional, terrestrial providers have been, hesitant to build out networks traditionally. So we are seeing these things happening. But again, you can take something like 5G. A lot of people are very excited about 5G, just as an example of like forward progress. And so, you'll see people getting very excited about it and touting it as this fantastic solution to the digital divide. And it really is. But ironically, deploying 5G is actually the most difficult in some of the areas that need it most, right? It's really best in a very dense urban environment where it can take advantage of the sort of, the millimeter wave technologies, the fastest speeds that it offers. In hyper rural areas, you're really not able to deploy that level of density of infrastructure. And so, 5G is actually a bit less intuitive than what some people might imagine when they start hearing, especially if you live in a rural area and you start hearing about these new technologies. You might be thinking, oh, this will be just what I need. But it isn't always so simple.
So let's hone in now on this, urban versus rural trend analysis. When we look at, for example, the top tier state of y'all's, best versus worst states with internet coverage, what defines a New Jersey as number one is really solid median download and upload speed, a healthy amount of internet providers, and a almost complete access to wired or fixed wireless broadband, as well as low-priced wired broadband. And when you're dealing with a smaller state like New Jersey, maybe it makes sense that they're able to spread the wealth a little easier. Once you start getting into these larger states, I know geography isn't everything, but it certainly plays a role. It's interesting to see that, there are states that are starting to, reach this level of broadband ubiquity that I think the industry is looking for across the board. But when we dig in further into cities versus rural environments, I think there is still a big question mark over whether cities are developing, like you said, not just generally, like, are things improving in cities, but are they improving fast enough and in the right way? Same question thrown down to the rural level, right? And the needs that are motivating the development of broadband in the city are going to be very different than the ones motivating the development of broadband in rural areas, at least in the short term, right? And so there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start simply here. We're seeing the development of technologies that are allowing for this internet ubiquity, right? Fixed wireless access, for example, saw millions of new subscribers in 2024. We also see 20 gigabit per second fiber getting launched in areas across the United States. So, technology is starting to meet the demands of the moment. I'm curious where you see tech, where you see services being at the bulwark of defining some of the development of broadband access in both rural and city environments, and where you see some differences or similarities. So let's hone in on technology first, and where you see those regional distinctions.
Well, you're right. I think the technology disparity between urban and rural communities is apparent now, but will become glaringly apparent over time. I think, again, going back to what I was saying before, considering that urban areas see the most concentration of network build-outs when it comes to overlapping networks and healthy competitive marketplaces that foster a general sense of competition and innovation. What we're seeing is that obviously, you're more likely to have access to a fiber network in those areas, and as a result, you can become accustomed to the things that connection provides you, right? Whereas in a rural community, you might be very excited to receive a different type of connection that obviously can massively change your ability to navigate the web and utilize all of its benefits. But you might be utilizing it in a different way than someone in a large city, right? You might be utilizing a technology that still has certain limitations, or if not now, will have limitations that come into play down the road. And when I talk about having to sort of walk and chew bubblegum at the same time with this issue and try to understand that it's an issue that we're trying to solve, it's very dynamic. I like to think of it this way. It's sort of like 20 years ago, for many of these people, or even 10 years ago, not having internet at all, being offline. It's like not having a car when everyone else was driving 30 miles per hour on the highway, right? You're definitely at a disadvantage, but you could still somewhat keep up through other means, right? But today, it's sort of like everyone's driving 70 miles per hour and you're just learning to drive. You're trying to merge onto the highway if you just get this broadband connection that's good enough and gets you going. But you might, that this could be a dangerous situation. You can't just slowly ease in to the internet anymore. And this is kind of, the dovetailing into the conversation of digital literacy, which I think is a massive part of this problem. Is for a lot of us, we have a 10, 20 year head start on operating the internet and sort of, understanding the sort of ins and outs of it and how to utilize it to better ourselves. You can't just ease yourself into that today. The baseline technical knowledge needed to protect yourself from potentially life-altering scams, right? Navigate increasingly complex telehealth systems that we're all increasingly relying on, accessing government services, right? Services that are incredibly important during disasters, which we've seen a lot of, right? Participate in the remote work economy, which has changed, millions of people's lives, myself included, right? And also handling things like digital banking. All of this has become increasingly complex, and the sort of digital newcomers are at a massive disadvantage already. So, when we talk about the infrastructure disparity, I think this is the thing that grounds it in the practical realities of the people that are utilizing these networks, right? Is right now those cars are moving 70 miles per hour. In a few years, they might be zooming down that highway at 130 miles per hour and trying to join the sort of digital economy, or take advantage of some of these transformative things like artificial intelligence being increasingly embedded into our everyday lives, telehealth, smart city deployments, as we've talked briefly about. All of these things are going to become, we can give people a connection, and we can kind of, finally close the digital divide and, wipe our hands of the problem and say, okay, we did it. But ultimately, we have to be readying a massive swath of the population to be able to not only have these connections, but take advantage of them, so that we can all enjoy some of the most transformative elements of being connected that we're likely to see over the next few years.